When you examine the naval warfare of the Pacific Theatre during the Second World War, you encounter one of history's most profound ironies, a tale of technological supremacy undone by tactical obsolescence, of massive investments in military hardware rendered meaningless by a shift in warfare doctrine that some saw coming but many refused to accept. The Imperial Japanese Navy had constructed what were, by any measure of engineering and industrial capability, the most formidable battleships ever to cut through ocean waters. These were vessels of such immense scale and destructive potential that their very existence seemed to rewrite the rules of naval combat. Their armor plating was thicker than the walls of most buildings you might find in any city, designed to withstand the most punishing bombardment that enemy warships could deliver. Their main batteries consisted of guns so enormous that the shells they fired weighed roughly the same as an automobile, projectiles that could be launched across distances that seemed almost incomprehensible, travelling through the air for miles before plunging down toward their targets with devastating force. The Imperial Navy had invested tremendous resources into these floating fortresses, operating under a strategic philosophy that had governed naval thinking since the age of sail, refined through the era of ironclads and dreadnoughts, and brought to what seemed like its ultimate expression in these massive warships. The doctrine they followed was clear and, to their minds, irrefutable. Naval supremacy would be decided in a climactic confrontation between battle fleets, a modern Trafalgar or Tsushima, where the side with superior firepower, better armour, and more disciplined gunnery would emerge victorious and thereby control the vast expanses of the Pacific Ocean. Every aspect of Japanese naval planning revolved around this anticipated decisive engagement, this moment when their battleships would meet the American battle line and, through the superiority of their vessels and the skill of their crews, would shatter enemy resistance and establish unquestioned dominance over the world's largest ocean. Yamato herself represented the pinnacle of this thinking, a warship that displaced 72,000 tons when fully loaded, carrying a crew of more than 2,000 men, each trained for their specific role in what was essentially a floating city dedicated entirely to the projection of naval power. Alongside her sailed sister ships and predecessors like Nagato and Fuso, each representing billions of yen in construction costs, years of industrial effort, and the finest work that Japanese naval architects and shipbuilders could produce. These weren't merely ships in the conventional sense, they were statements of national power, embodiments of Japan's determination to stand as a first-rate naval power, equals or superiors to any navy the Western powers could field. The guns mounted on Yamato were 18 inches in diameter, larger than any naval rifles ever installed on a warship, capable of hurling shells that weighed over 3,000 pounds across distances exceeding 25 miles. The engineering required to make such weapons function reliably was staggering. The turrets that housed these guns weighed more than small destroyers, rotating on complex machinery that represented some of the most advanced mechanical engineering of the era. Yet for all this investment, all this careful planning and magnificent engineering, these battleships possessed vulnerabilities that their designers had understood but could not fully address given the constraints of physics and naval architecture. Battleships, by their very nature, were creatures of the surface, designed to engage other surface combatants in contests where armour, speed and firepower would determine the victor. Their armour schemes were optimised to defeat shells approaching at relatively flat trajectories, fired from enemy battleships engaging at ranges of 10 to 20 miles. Their main batteries could only depress and elevate within certain limits, designed for ship-to-ship combat rather than anti-aircraft defence. Most critically, they were slow compared to aircraft, unable to manoeuvre with anything approaching the agility that would have been required to avoid aerial attack. Even at flank speed, a battleship like Yamato could make perhaps 27 knots, fast for such a massive vessel but glacial when compared to aircraft that could exceed 200 miles per hour. The ships were also functionally blind to threats approaching from above, at least in the early years of the war. Their fire control systems, marvels of mechanical computing designed to solve the complex trigonometric problems involved in hitting a moving target from a moving platform across miles of ocean, were optimized for surface targets. The radar systems that might have provided early warning of aerial attack were either absent in the war's opening years or primitive compared to what the Americans would eventually field. Lookouts scanning the skies with binoculars provided the primary means of detecting incoming aircraft, and by the time human eyes spotted attacking planes, those aircraft were often already beginning their attack runs, too close for effective defensive response. The anti-aircraft armament that these battleships carried was, particularly early in the conflict, woefully inadequate to the task of defending against determined aerial assault. We'll return to this critical weakness repeatedly, because it represents perhaps the single most important factor in explaining why these magnificent ships proved so vulnerable. Into this situation came American naval aviation, which had been developing throughout the interwar years, despite receiving less attention and fewer resources than the battle fleet itself. The aircraft that would ultimately prove decisive were, when you examine their specifications and capabilities, almost laughably small and fragile compared to the targets they were designed to attack. Consider the Douglas TBD Devastator, the primary American torpedo bomber at the war's outset. This was an aircraft that, when fully loaded with fuel, crew, and its torpedo, weighed approximately 10,000 pounds. To put this in perspective, Yamato outweighed a Devastator by a factor of roughly 14,000 to 1. The disparity in size and apparent power seems almost absurd. The Devastator was constructed largely of aluminum and fabric, materials chosen for their lightweight rather than their protective qualities. Its crew of 3 men sat in an open or lightly enclosed cockpit, exposed to the elements and to enemy fire, protected by nothing more substantial than the thin metal skin of the aircraft itself. The plane's maximum speed was around 200 miles per hour, respectable for its time but not remarkable, and when approaching for a torpedo attack, it had to slow to perhaps half that speed to successfully release its weapon. Everything about the Devastator suggested fragility and vulnerability. Its defensive armament consisted of a single forward-firing machine gun controlled by the pilot and another machine gun in the rear cockpit operated by the gunner, weapons utterly inadequate against the massed anti-aircraft fire a battleship could generate. The plane's range, while sufficient for carrier operations, meant that aircrews had to carefully calculate their fuel consumption, knowing that any miscalculation might leave them unable to return to their carrier, forced to ditch in the open ocean with only a small inflatable raft for survival. These were not aircraft designed for comfort or safety. They were designed to deliver one specific weapon to one specific target under the most challenging possible circumstances, and everything about their design reflected that narrow but critical purpose. That weapon, the Mark 13 torpedo, represents one of the most significant weapons of the Pacific War, though it often receives less attention than the more dramatic dive bombers or fighters that captured public imagination. The Mark 13 was a cylinder of steel approximately 13 feet long and just under 22 inches in diameter, containing machinery and explosives in a carefully balanced package designed to do one thing: run true through the water and explode against the hull of an enemy vessel. The warhead contained roughly 600 pounds of high explosive, though the figure of 500 pounds is sometimes cited depending on the specific variant and loading. This may not sound like an overwhelming amount of explosive power when you're talking about attacking a ship displacing tens of thousands of tons, but the key lies not in the raw explosive power, but in where and how that explosive force is delivered. A torpedo doesn't simply hit the side of a ship and explode on contact the way a shell might. Instead, it runs beneath the surface, often set to detonate several feet below the waterline, sometimes even underneath the keel of the target vessel. When the warhead detonates, it creates a massive bubble of expanding gas underwater, a bubble that grows with tremendous speed and force, pushing against the hull with pressures that no armor scheme can fully resist, because the explosion is occurring in an entirely different medium than the one for which the armor was designed. Water, being incompressible, transmits shock waves with devastating efficiency. The explosive force doesn't simply punch a hole in the hull. It can buckle plates, rupture seams, collapse bulkheads, and send shock waves through the entire structure of the ship, breaking machinery loose from its mountings, shattering pipes and conduits, and creating chaos throughout the vessel's interior spaces. More critically, a torpedo hit below the waterline means that the ocean immediately begins flooding into the ship through the breach. A battleship like Yamato was subdivided into hundreds of watertight compartments, each separated from its neighbours by bulkheads that could theoretically be sealed to prevent flooding from spreading throughout the vessel. This compartmentalization was the ship's primary defence against underwater damage. The designers knew that torpedoes and mines could breach the hull, so they created a complex system of subdivision that would, in theory, allow the ship to survive multiple hits by isolating the flooded sections and maintaining enough buoyancy in the undamaged portions to keep the vessel afloat. The problem was that this system had limits. Each torpedo hit flooded multiple compartments. The shock of the explosion could damage watertight doors and hatches, preventing them from sealing properly. Pipes and electrical conduits running through multiple compartments created paths for water to spread even when bulkheads were closed. And critically, flooding in one section of the ship created an imbalance, causing the vessel to list, and once a ship developed a significant list, the whole compartmentalization scheme began to break down because water could flow over the tops of bulkheads that were designed to contain flooding only when the ship was relatively level. The mathematics of this situation were brutally simple. A weapon that could be carried by a single aircraft, a weapon that weighed roughly 1 ton, could inflict damage requiring the flooding of thousands of tons of water into a ship's hull, damage that disabled machinery weighing hundreds of tons, damage that might ultimately send a vessel displacing 70,000 tons to the bottom of the ocean. The force multiplication was extraordinary. A Devastator and its crew of 3, representing an investment of perhaps a few $100,000 in aircraft, training and equipment, could potentially sink a battleship representing an investment of hundreds of millions of dollars and carrying a crew of 2,000 men. The asymmetry wasn't just tactical, it was economic and strategic as well. The Battle of Midway in early June of 1942 demonstrated these principles with shocking clarity, though the lessons were written in the blood of American air crews who paid a terrible price to deliver them. The Japanese plan for Midway was characteristically ambitious and complex, involving multiple task forces approaching from different directions, with the intention of drawing out the American carriers and destroying them while simultaneously occupying Midway Atoll itself. The battleships were there, massive vessels like Yamato serving as Admiral Yamamoto's flagship, positioned to deliver the decisive blow once the carriers had softened up American resistance. The plan relied on achieving surprise and on the assumption that American carriers, if present at all, would be too few and too poorly positioned to interfere effectively with Japanese operations. Instead, American codebreakers had provided Admiral Nimitz with detailed information about Japanese intentions, allowing him to position his carriers in ambush, waiting for the Japanese fleet to come within range. When the battle began, the first American attacks were catastrophic failures from a tactical perspective. Torpedo squadrons flying Devastators launched their attacks without fighter escort, having become separated from their supporting aircraft during the approach. They came in low over the water, exactly as doctrine required for torpedo attacks, flying slowly and steadily to ensure accurate drops, and they were massacred. Japanese fighters fell on them like wolves on sheep. Anti-aircraft fire from the carriers and their escorts created walls of exploding metal that the slow-moving torpedo bombers had to fly through. One squadron after another was virtually wiped out. Of the 41 Devastators that attacked, only 6 survived to return to their carriers. Entire squadrons were annihilated. Torpedo Squadron 8 from the USS Hornet launched 15 aircraft. Only one pilot survived, and he didn't even make it back to the carrier, being picked up from the water hours later. These men knew what they were flying into. They could see the fighters swarming above them, could see the black puffs of anti-aircraft fire filling the air ahead, but they pressed their attacks anyway because that was their mission, and because they hoped that somehow, through skill or luck or sheer determination, they might get their torpedoes into the water and score the hits that would cripple the Japanese carriers. Very few of them did. The torpedo attacks, considered purely in terms of damage inflicted, were almost complete failures. But they had one critical effect that changed the entire course of the battle. By forcing the Japanese carriers to maneuver violently to avoid the incoming torpedoes, by pulling the Japanese fighter cover down to low altitude to deal with the torpedo bombers, by creating chaos and confusion in the carefully orchestrated Japanese operations, these doomed attacks set the stage for what came next. The American dive bombers, approaching at high altitude while the torpedo attacks were in progress, found the Japanese carriers in the worst possible position. The ships were scattered, having maneuvered independently to avoid torpedoes. Their fighters were at low altitude or landing to refuel and rearm, unavailable to intercept the dive bombers. Their flight decks were crowded with aircraft being prepared for strikes against the American carriers, planes loaded with fuel and ordnance that would prove catastrophically vulnerable when the American bombs began to fall. In the span of perhaps 5 minutes, American dive bombers put bombs into 3 Japanese carriers. The hits weren't particularly numerous, perhaps 3 or 4 bombs per carrier, but they struck at the worst possible moment, igniting fires among the armed and fueled aircraft on the flight decks, fires that spread rapidly through the hangar decks, detonating stored ordnance and creating infernos that overwhelmed damage control efforts. Within hours, 3 carriers were burning uncontrollably. A 4th would be caught and bombed later in the day. By sunset, the Japanese fleet was retreating, having lost 4 carriers and hundreds of aircraft and aircrew. The battleships that had been positioned to deliver the decisive blow never fired their main batteries at enemy ships. They were too slow to close the distance, too vulnerable to air attack to risk advancing without carrier support, and ultimately irrelevant to the outcome of the battle. Yamato and her companions could only watch as carriers burned and sank, could only retreat back toward Japan with their massive guns silent and their role in the battle amounting to nothing more than spectators to a disaster. One Japanese officer, trying to make sense of what had happened, described the American torpedo attacks as resembling the assault of suicidal mosquitoes, tiny creatures throwing themselves against giants with no hope of survival. But the metaphor was more apt than he realized, because mosquitoes carrying disease can indeed kill lions, and the torpedo bombers, even in their destruction, had carried the disease of chaos and confusion that allowed the dive bombers to deliver the fatal blows. The question of armour deserves careful examination because it reveals another dimension of the battleship's vulnerability to aerial attack. Japanese battleships carried armour protection that, when measured in raw thickness, seems almost incredible. Yamato's main armour belt, the thick steel plates protecting her vital spaces at the waterline, measured 16 inches thick in places, steel of such quality and in such quantity that its very existence represented a major industrial achievement. This armour could resist armour-piercing shells fired from the largest guns afloat. Tests and calculations showed that Yamato's protection scheme could withstand hits from 18-inch guns at all but the closest ranges. The designers had created what they believed to be an essentially unsinkable ship, a vessel that could absorb tremendous punishment and continue fighting. But all of this armour, all of this carefully calculated protection, was optimized for a specific threat. Shells approaching at relatively flat angles, fired from enemy battleships engaging at ranges of 10 to 20 miles. The armour scheme anticipated shells plunging down from high-angle trajectories at long range, or shells arriving at flatter angles at closer ranges. But in either case, the threat model assumed projectiles striking above the waterline, hitting the armoured belt or the armoured deck, threats that could be defeated through sufficient thickness of high-quality steel plate. What the armour scheme could not adequately address was underwater attack. The bottom of the ship, the areas below the armoured belt, were protected by the hull plating itself and by the subdivision into watertight compartments. but this protection was inherently less robust than the massive armor plates higher up on the hull. Torpedoes exploited this vulnerability ruthlessly. By running beneath the surface and detonating against or beneath the hull below the armor belt, they attacked the ship at its weakest point. The explosive force propagated through water with devastating efficiency, as we discussed earlier, and the resulting damage was different in character from shell damage. A shell might punch through armor, creating a hole, but a torpedo created massive structural disruption, flooding, and potentially the worst possible outcome. A progressive list that would compromise the ship's stability and make it increasingly difficult to control damage and maintain buoyancy. Pearl Harbor on December 7, 1941, provided the most dramatic early demonstration of what aerial torpedoes could do to battleships. The Japanese employed modified aerial torpedoes specifically designed to run in the shallow waters of Pearl Harbor, weapons that had been extensively tested and refined to ensure they would work in conditions where conventional torpedoes would have simply ploughed into the harbor bottom. These torpedoes slammed into American battleships moored along Battleship Row, and the results were catastrophic. USS Arizona took a torpedo hit that, while not immediately fatal in itself, contributed to the destruction of the ship when a bomb penetrated her forward magazine, creating an explosion that broke the vessel's back and killed over 1,000 men in seconds. Other battleships took multiple torpedo hits. USS Oklahoma rolled over and capsized after being struck by 3, possibly 4 torpedoes in rapid succession. The flooding so rapid and severe that the ship simply lost stability and turned turtle, trapping hundreds of men inside her hull. The attack demonstrated several important principles. First, it showed that battleships in harbour, unable to manoeuvre, were desperately vulnerable to aerial torpedo attack. Second, it proved that the technology and tactics for such attacks had been perfected by the Japanese Navy, which had invested heavily in carrier aviation and had trained relentlessly for exactly this kind of operation. Third, it revealed that even modern battleships with presumably sophisticated damage control systems could be overwhelmed by determined attack. The American battleships at Pearl Harbor were not ancient relics. Several were relatively recent construction, yet they proved just as vulnerable as older vessels when subjected to weapons they had not been designed to resist. The Battle of Leyte Gulf in October 1944 presented perhaps the most dramatic example of battleships being destroyed by aerial attack, particularly during the airstrikes against the Japanese center force as it transited the Sibuyan Sea on October 24. This engagement involved Musashi, Yamato's sister ship, a vessel virtually identical in capabilities and protection. American carrier aircraft, alerted to the presence of the Japanese fleet, launched strike after strike against center force as it steamed toward the landing beaches at Leyte. The attacks focused particularly on Musashi, the most powerful ship in the formation, and therefore the highest priority target. The Americans came in waves, mixing torpedo bombers and dive bombers to ensure that Musashi's anti-aircraft defenses would be split, forced to deal with threats approaching from multiple altitudes and directions simultaneously. The torpedo bombers, now mostly TBF Avengers rather than the obsolete Devastators that had suffered so terribly at Midway, came in low, skimming the waves, their pilots holding their aircraft steady despite the intense anti-aircraft fire, waiting until they were close enough for their torpedoes to have a reasonable chance of hitting. The dive bombers came from above, rolling into their dives from altitude, plummeting toward the ship and releasing their bombs at the last possible moment before pulling out, hopefully having put their ordnance onto the target before the tremendous G-forces of the pullout caused them to lose consciousness or their aircraft to break apart from structural stress. Musashi's anti-aircraft fire was more substantial than what had been available earlier in the war. The ship mounted dozens of 25mm anti-aircraft guns, plus larger caliber weapons, creating a dense field of fire around the vessel. The gunners fired frantically as the American planes bored in, knowing that every aircraft they could shoot down was one less bomb or torpedo that might hit their ship. Some American planes fell, trailing smoke and flame, their crews having only seconds to recognize their fate before impact with the water. But many more got through. Torpedoes dropped into the sea and ran toward Musashi's hull, their wakes visible on the surface, giving the ship's lookouts only seconds of warning before impact. Bombs released from diving aircraft plunged toward the deck, some missing, splashing into the sea nearby and sending up towering columns of water, others striking home with the distinctive crump of explosives detonating against armor plate. The attacks continued for hours. Each wave of aircraft inflicted more damage, flooding more compartments, starting more fires, creating more casualties among the crew. Musashi's damage control parties worked desperately, shoring up bulkheads, fighting fires, treating wounded, all while more attacks kept coming. The ship began to develop a list as flooding in one section created an imbalance. Counter-flooding, pumping water into compartments on the opposite side of the ship to restore balance, could only do so much before the total weight of water in the hull began to affect buoyancy. Engineering spaces flooded, reducing power and speed. Steering was damaged, making the ship harder to maneuver. Anti-aircraft guns were knocked out by near misses or by fragments from explosions, reducing the ship's ability to defend itself against subsequent attacks. By late afternoon, Musashi had taken 19 torpedo hits and 17 bomb hits, according to most accounts, though the exact numbers are disputed and difficult to verify given the chaos of battle. What's undisputed is that no vessel, no matter how well armoured or well designed, could withstand that level of damage. The flooding was catastrophic, spreading through dozens of compartments, overwhelming the pumps, exceeding the capacity of the damage control organisation to cope. The ship's list increased steadily, reaching 15 degrees, then 20 degrees, angles at which normal operations become increasingly difficult, and the risk of capsizing becomes very real. The captain ordered the crew to abandon the forward part of the ship, concentrating them amidships and aft where they might have a better chance of survival if the ship went down. In the early evening, with the list exceeding 30 degrees and continuing to increase, Musashi finally rolled over and sank, taking more than 1,000 of her crew with her. The most powerful battleship in the Japanese fleet, a vessel that had cost years of construction effort and represented one of the finest achievements of Japanese naval architecture, had been destroyed by aircraft. Not by other battleships in a gunnery duel, not by mines or submarines, but by the accumulation of hits from bombs and torpedoes delivered by carrier aircraft. Each individual weapon that struck Musashi was tiny compared to the ship herself, but their cumulative effect was overwhelming. The economic dimensions of this equation deserve attention because they reveal yet another level of the asymmetry between battleships and aircraft. A battleship like Yamato consumed fuel at a prodigious rate when operating at combat speeds. The figure of 600 tons per day is sometimes cited, though the exact consumption varied based on speed and operating conditions. What's indisputable is that these ships were extraordinarily thirsty, requiring vast quantities of fuel oil to feed their boilers and maintain their operations. An Avenger, by contrast, might burn through 150 gallons of aviation gasoline during a complete mission, take off to landing, perhaps 200 gallons if the mission involved extended searching or combat. When you calculate the relative fuel consumption, the numbers are staggering. One battleship, operating for a day, consumed roughly the same amount of petroleum products as thousands of aircraft sorties. For Japan, a nation that entered the war with inadequate petroleum reserves and limited access to oil-producing regions, this arithmetic was devastating. Every day, a battleship spent at sea consumed fuel that could have supported hundreds of aircraft missions. Every ton of fuel oil allocated to the battle fleet was a ton that couldn't be used for cargo vessels, transports, or other critical purposes. The Americans, blessed with access to essentially unlimited petroleum from domestic production and from secured sources overseas, faced no such constraints. They could fuel their carriers, their aircraft, and their entire fleet without significant concern for petroleum supplies. This fundamental economic reality meant that even if Japanese battleships had been tactically effective, Japan could not have sustained a lengthy war of attrition against an enemy with such superior resource access. The question of accuracy in naval gunnery adds another dimension to our understanding of why battleships proved inadequate. The main batteries of these ships, those enormous 18-inch guns on Yamato or the 16-inch guns on American battleships, could indeed fire projectiles across distances exceeding 25 miles in some cases. The maximum range was impressive from a purely technical standpoint, representing a tremendous achievement in metallurgy, propellant chemistry, and mechanical engineering. But maximum range and effective range are entirely different concepts. Hitting a target at extreme range, particularly a target that's maneuvering and potentially obscured by poor visibility, smoke, or rain, was extraordinarily difficult. The hit probabilities at ranges exceeding 20,000 yards were generally estimated at less than 2%, sometimes considerably less, meaning that even under good conditions, more than 98 shells out of every 100 would miss their target. Even at moderate ranges of 10 to 15,000 yards, hit rates in actual combat seldom exceeded 10%. This meant that to ensure hitting an enemy ship, a battleship might need to fire dozens, potentially hundreds of shells, an expensive and time-consuming process. The fire control systems that calculated the necessary firing solutions were marvels of mechanical computing, but they could only work with the data provided, and factors like wind speed, air density, powder temperature, barrel wear, and a dozen other variables all affected where shells would actually land. Spotting the fall of shot and making corrections was difficult, requiring clear visibility and often relying on aircraft for observation. Torpedo planes, by contrast, operated under entirely different accuracy constraints. They dropped their weapons from ranges measured in hundreds of yards, sometimes less than 1,000 feet from the target. At those ranges, if the torpedo ran true and the drop was executed properly, hitting a battleship-sized target was highly probable. The targets were enormous, hundreds of feet long, and unless they could somehow maneuver violently enough to cause the torpedo to miss, they would be hit. This wasn't guaranteed, certainly. Torpedoes could malfunction, could run too deep or too shallow, could veer off course, but when everything worked as designed, the chances of a hit were far higher than the chances of a battleship shell striking a maneuvering target at 20,000 yards. The weakness of Japanese anti-aircraft defenses magnified all of these other factors. Early in the war, as noted, Japanese battleships relied primarily on 25mm automatic cannons for anti-aircraft defense. These were derivative of French weapons, manufactured under license, and while they were functional, they suffered from several significant shortcomings. Their rate of fire was modest compared to American 40mm Bofors guns or the later American 20mm Oerlikon cannons. Their sights were relatively primitive, making it difficult to track and lead fast-moving aircraft effectively. Their explosive shells had limited reach and relatively small bursts. American pilots who faced these weapons reported that while they created impressive visual displays, tracers and shell bursts filling the sky around attacking aircraft, they were not particularly effective at actually bringing down planes. One pilot's observation that the Japanese filled the sky with sparks but never hit him captures this perfectly. The anti-aircraft fire looked terrifying, appeared dense and overwhelming, but its actual effectiveness at destroying attacking aircraft was modest. Even as the war progressed and Japanese defenses improved, adding more guns and developing better fire control, the fundamental problem remained. Anti-aircraft gunnery is extraordinarily difficult. The target is small, fast-moving, and capable of maneuvering unpredictably. The gunner must calculate a lead angle, pointing the gun not at where the aircraft is, but at where it will be when the shells arrive, a calculation that requires predicting the target's future position based on its current course and speed. Under combat conditions, with multiple aircraft attacking from different directions, with the stress of combat affecting performance, with visibility potentially reduced by smoke and spray, hitting aircraft consistently was incredibly challenging. By the time Yamato made her final sortie in April 1945, she mounted over 150 anti-aircraft guns of various calibers, the most formidable anti-aircraft armament ever installed on a warship. Yet even this massive defensive battery could not prevent American aircraft from putting multiple torpedoes and bombs into her. That final battle deserves detailed attention because it represents the ultimate demonstration of everything we've been discussing. In early April of 1945, Japan ordered a desperate operation designated Tengo, a plan that called for Yamato to sortie to Okinawa, where American forces had recently landed, and there beach herself to serve as an unsinkable artillery platform, using her enormous guns to bombard the invasion beaches until she was destroyed. The operation was recognized as suicidal from the start. Yamato would sail without air cover, with only a handful of escorting destroyers, carrying only enough fuel for a one-way trip. The ship would be sacrificed in a final gesture of defiance, a last demonstration of the fighting spirit that Japan's leadership believed would somehow make a difference in a war that was already clearly lost. On April 7th, Yamato and her escorts were detected by American submarines and reconnaissance aircraft as they transited south through the East China Sea. Admiral Mitcher, commanding the American carrier task force operating off Okinawa, immediately ordered strikes. Nearly 400 aircraft launched from multiple carriers, an overwhelming force sent to destroy a single battleship and her escorts. The Americans were taking no chances. They knew Yamato's capabilities, knew her armor and firepower, and they intended to sink her with absolute certainty, using whatever level of force proved necessary. The attack began around midday. American aircraft approached in coordinated waves, torpedo bombers and dive bombers working together to split Yamato's defenses and ensure that no matter how the ship maneuvered, she would expose herself to attack from some direction. The battleship's anti-aircraft guns opened fire as the aircraft came within range, creating the characteristic pattern of black shell bursts against the sky, tracers arcing up toward the attacking planes. Some aircraft were hit, falling from the sky or limping away trailing smoke. But the attack was relentless, wave after wave boring in despite the defensive fire. Torpedoes began hitting the ship, each impact sending shudders through the massive hull, flooding compartments, adding to the cumulative damage. Bombs struck from above, punching through deck armor in some cases, exploding inside the ship, starting fires and destroying equipment. The crew fought desperately, manning their guns, containing damage, following their training and their duty even as the situation grew increasingly hopeless. The ship began listing to port as flooding accumulated on that side. Counter-flooding was ordered to restore balance, but the amount of water being taken on was simply too great. The list continued increasing, reaching 5 degrees, then 10, then 15. Over a period of roughly 2 hours, Yamato took 11 torpedo hits and 6 bomb hits according to the most commonly accepted accounts. Each hit inflicted significant damage. Each torpedo flooded more compartments, each bomb started more fires or destroyed more equipment. The cumulative effect was catastrophic. The ship lost electrical power in sections, making damage control more difficult. Steering was damaged, limiting the ship's ability to maneuver. Speed decreased as engineering spaces flooded. The list continued increasing despite all efforts to control it. By early afternoon, Yamato was clearly doomed. The list had exceeded 20 degrees and was still increasing. Water was pouring into the ship through dozens of breaches. Fires burned out of control in multiple locations. The captain gave the order to abandon ship, but for many crew members, this order came too late or was impossible to execute given their locations within the dying vessel. As the list reached 30 degrees, then 40, the ship became increasingly unstable. Men struggled to move across decks that were tilted at crazy angles, sliding down toward the low side, trying desperately to reach the high side where they might have a chance to jump clear before the ship went under. At approximately 2:20 in the afternoon, Yamato capsized and exploded, the explosion so massive that it was visible for dozens of miles, a towering column of smoke and flame marking the final moment of the most powerful battleship ever constructed. The explosion likely occurred when flooding water reached the ship's forward magazines, detonating the hundreds of tons of explosives and propellant stored there. The blast broke the ship apart, sending debris hundreds of feet into the air. Of the crew of over 3,000 men, fewer than 300 survived, picked up from the water by escorting destroyers. The rest went down with their ship, dying in the explosion or drowning in the minutes that followed as the broken hull plunged toward the sea floor. The cost accounting of this battle is illuminating in its brutality. Each of Yamato's 18-inch shells cost roughly $30,000 in contemporary 1940s currency, equivalent to perhaps $50,000 or more in today's money when adjusted for inflation. The Mark 13 torpedoes that killed her cost approximately $1,000 each in wartime currency. The bombs were even cheaper. In essence, weapons costing a few $1,000s each destroyed a vessel that had cost the equivalent of hundreds of millions of dollars to construct and represented years of industrial effort. 10 or 12 torpedoes, combined with half a dozen bombs, accomplished what no battleship could have achieved, sinking the pride of the Japanese Navy in an afternoon without any American surface ships even coming within visual range of the target. This economic reality reflects a deeper truth about the evolution of warfare in the 20th century. The Pacific War demonstrated that military power was increasingly about force multiplication, about finding ways to project destructive capability with maximum efficiency rather than maximum direct investment. An aircraft carrier could carry dozens of aircraft, each capable of attacking targets hundreds of miles from the carrier itself. The carrier's guns might be relatively modest, just enough to provide point defense against aircraft that penetrated the defensive screen, but the carrier's striking power, delivered through its aircraft, vastly exceeded what any battleship could bring to bear. A carrier strike group could attack targets at ranges exceeding 200 miles, projecting power across an enormous area, while a battleship's effective range was limited to perhaps 20 miles at most, and even that only against targets that could be located and engaged with the main battery. The Japanese naval leadership understood these principles at one level. They had pioneered carrier aviation, had developed the tactics and doctrine that made Pearl Harbor possible, had trained aircrew to exceptional levels of proficiency. But they also remained wedded to the decisive battle doctrine, to the idea that ultimate victory would be achieved through the guns of the battle fleet. This split in strategic thinking meant that resources were divided, with enormous investments going into battleships like Yamato, even while the carriers were receiving insufficient support in terms of aircraft production, aircrew training, and logistical preparation. The result was a navy that possessed magnificent individual units but lacked the coherent strategic approach necessary to leverage those units effectively. American naval thinking evolved differently, partly because of circumstances and partly because of deliberate choices made before and during the war. The Washington Naval Treaty of 1922 had limited battleship construction, forcing navies to focus on other types of vessels, including carriers. When war came, American industry had the capacity to produce ships, aircraft, and weapons in quantities that Japan simply could not match. The Americans made a strategic decision to prioritize carrier construction and aircraft production, building dozens of carriers of various sizes and tens of thousands of aircraft. The Essex-class fleet carriers that formed the core of American fast carrier task forces represented a design philosophy that prioritized aircraft capacity and operational flexibility over armor protection. These ships could operate large air groups, could sustain high-tempo operations, and could be produced in quantity, advantages that proved decisive in the attritional warfare that characterized the Pacific Campaign. The human dimension of this story deserves recognition because the statistics and strategic analysis can obscure the fact that we're discussing human beings caught in circumstances beyond their control, following orders and doing their duty in the face of dangers they fully understood. Japanese sailors who served aboard battleships like Yamato and Musashi were not fools. They knew their ships were vulnerable to air attack. They had seen what happened to carriers at Midway, had watched as Japanese naval superiority eroded throughout 1943 and 44. By the time Yamato made her final sortie, the crew knew they were sailing to their deaths. Some kept diaries, later recovered from survivors, in which they expressed their understanding that the mission was suicidal, their resignation to their fate, and their determination to do their duty regardless. The American air crews who attacked these ships also understood the dangers they faced. Flying through intense anti-aircraft fire to reach torpedo drop positions was terrifying. The losses suffered by torpedo squadrons at Midway demonstrated that these attacks could have casualty rates exceeding 90%. Every pilot who pushed his attack home despite seeing other planes shot down around him, every gunner who kept his weapon firing even as anti-aircraft shells burst nearby, every crew member who flew his damaged aircraft back to the carrier despite serious wounds or mechanical failures demonstrated courage of a very high order. These were not remote video game-like experiences. The men involved could see each other, could watch their targets and their opponents, could recognize the human cost of what they were doing, even as they continued to do it, because that was their mission and their duty. The broader lesson that emerges from this examination of battleships and aerial attack is about the nature of military technology and the dangers of preparing to fight the last war rather than the next one. The Japanese Navy built its battle fleet around assumptions that had been valid in 1918, and that seemed reasonable through the 1920s and 30s. Battleships had dominated naval warfare since the ironclad age. The decisive battle concept had historical precedent going back centuries. The idea that naval supremacy would be decided by the clash of battle fleets seemed obvious and natural. But technology was evolving in ways that made those assumptions increasingly questionable. Aircraft were getting faster, more reliable, and more capable. Carrier doctrine was maturing. Tactics for coordinated strikes were being developed and refined. By the time war actually came, the battleship's era of dominance had already passed, but institutional inertia and investment in existing platforms meant that both Japan and the United States continued building battleships even as carriers were proving to be the decisive weapons of naval warfare. The Americans adapted more quickly, partly because circumstances forced them to. The battleship losses at Pearl Harbor, while devastating, meant that the Pacific Fleet had no choice but to rely on carriers. As those carriers demonstrated their effectiveness throughout 1942 and 43, resources increasingly flowed toward carrier construction and aircraft production. The fast battleships that the United States produced later in the war, vessels like the Iowa class, were designed primarily to escort carriers, providing anti-aircraft defense and serving as platforms for radar and communications equipment, rather than as independent platforms for ship-to-ship combat. The Japanese never fully made this transition. They continued to plan operations around the decisive battle concept, positioning their battleships to deliver the killing blow against American carriers or the American battle line, and those opportunities simply never materialized because the nature of naval warfare had fundamentally changed. Looking at the specific technical details reinforces these conclusions. The Mark 13 torpedo, after its early problems were resolved through better testing and quality control, proved to be a reliable and effective weapon. Its range of approximately 6,000 yards when dropped from altitude gave aircraft a standoff capability, allowing them to launch outside the most effective range of anti-aircraft guns. Its relatively high speed, around 33 knots, meant that ships had limited time to maneuver after detecting the torpedo wake. Its warhead, while not enormous by later standards, was more than adequate to inflict serious damage on any warship when detonating underwater against the hull. Combined with the ability of carrier aircraft to attack in coordinated waves, mixing torpedo attacks from different directions with dive bombing from above, the weapon system proved devastating against targets that had been designed primarily to resist surface threats. The development of tactics for these attacks reflected careful thought and hard-won experience. Early in the war, attacks were often poorly coordinated, with torpedo bombers and dive bombers arriving at different times or from different directions, allowing defenders to concentrate on one threat at a time. As the war progressed, American doctrine emphasized simultaneous attacks from multiple axes, forcing defenders to split their fire and increasing the chances that some attackers would get through. The hammer and anvil technique, where torpedo bombers attacked from one direction while dive bombers attacked from a different angle, proved particularly effective because targets maneuvering to avoid torpedoes exposed themselves to bombs, and vice versa. These were not tactics that could be developed overnight. They required training, practice, and institutional learning from combat experience. But once mastered, they made coordinated carrier strikes almost impossible to defend against effectively. The radar technology that became increasingly important as the war progressed also favored the aircraft over the battleship. While Japanese battleships gained radar capabilities during the war, their radar systems were generally less sophisticated and less effectively integrated into fire control than American systems. American ships used radar for early warning, fire control, and even as a bombing aid for aircraft conducting attacks in poor visibility. This technology multiplied the effectiveness of aircraft by allowing them to find and attack targets that might have been hidden by darkness, clouds, or weather conditions that would have made visual navigation and targeting impossible. For battleships, radar provided warning of attacks but didn't fundamentally change their ability to defend themselves. The combination of radar-equipped aircraft and radar-directed anti-aircraft fire created a lopsided equation where attacking aircraft could find targets reliably, while defensive fire became more accurate, but not accurate enough to prevent determined attacks from succeeding. When you step back and consider the entire sweep of these engagements, from Pearl Harbor through Midway, Leyte Gulf, and finally Yamato's last sortie, a clear pattern emerges. Battleships, regardless of how well designed or powerfully armed, could not survive against determined aerial attack. They could inflict casualties on attacking aircraft. They could shoot down planes and disrupt attacks. But they could not prevent sufficient numbers of bombs and torpedoes from hitting to cause fatal damage. The mathematics of the situation simply didn't work in the battleship's favor. Enough attackers would always get through, and enough hits would accumulate to overwhelm even the most sophisticated damage control organization and the most robust protection scheme. This reality manifested in different ways depending on the specific circumstances, but the underlying dynamic remained constant. At Pearl Harbor, surprise and the confined waters of the harbor meant that American battleships had no opportunity to maneuver or to put up effective defensive fire before being struck. At Midway, Japanese carriers, rather than battleships, bore the brunt of American attacks, but the principle was the same, with aerial attack proving decisive. At Leyte Gulf, Musashi demonstrated that even when prepared for air attack, even when mounting substantial anti-aircraft defenses and with crew at general quarters ready to fight, a battleship could be overwhelmed by sustained attacks. And finally, with Yamato's destruction, the point was proven beyond any possibility of dispute. The age of the battleship as a decisive naval weapon was over. The human cost of this transition was enormous. Thousands of Japanese sailors went down with their ships, men who had trained for years, who believed they were serving aboard the most powerful warships afloat, who died in battles that their ships were never designed to fight. American aircrew also paid a heavy price, particularly in the early battles when tactics were still being developed and defenses were strongest. The waters of the Pacific became the graveyard for dozens of capital ships and hundreds of aircraft, each loss representing human tragedy multiplied by the number of crew members who did not survive. Yet from a purely analytical perspective, the story is one of technological evolution and strategic adaptation. Warfare in the industrial age has always been characterized by rapid change, with new weapons systems and tactics continually emerging to challenge existing approaches. The battleship's dominance lasted for several decades, from roughly the 1880s through perhaps the 1930s, a period during which these ships represented the ultimate expression of naval power. But that era ended, not because battleships suddenly became poorly designed or ineffective at what they were meant to do, but because the nature of naval warfare itself changed in ways that rendered their primary capabilities less relevant than other forms of power projection. The lessons remain relevant today, even in an age where naval warfare has evolved far beyond anything imaginable in the 1940s. Military establishments must constantly evaluate whether their platforms and doctrines remain appropriate for current and future conflicts, rather than assuming that what worked previously will continue to work. The investment in any major weapon system represents a bet on the future character of warfare, and getting that bet wrong can have catastrophic consequences. Japan's investment in battleships represented a massive allocation of resources toward platforms that proved unable to accomplish their intended missions when actual combat came. Those resources might have produced carriers, aircraft, submarines, or other systems that could have been more effective, though whether any alternative allocation would have changed the war's ultimate outcome is debatable, given the enormous disparity in industrial capacity between Japan and the United States. In the end, the story of Japanese battleships and American torpedo planes illustrates one of warfare's fundamental truths: that victory goes not necessarily to the side with the most impressive-looking weapons or the most heavily armoured platforms, but to the side that best understands the character of the conflict and deploys the right tools for the actual job at hand. Yamato and Musashi were magnificent achievements of naval architecture, but they were answers to questions that the war never asked. The battles that decided the Pacific campaign were fought and won by carriers and their aircraft, not by battleships with their massive guns. The torpedo bombers that proved so devastating were fragile, vulnerable machines, but they carried weapons that could exploit weaknesses in even the most heavily armoured ships. David defeated Goliath not through superior strength, but through using a weapon that Goliath's armour could not defeat. The parallel is almost too obvious, but it captures something essential about this particular chapter of military history. Giants were indeed torn apart by mosquitoes, and the lesson, written in steel and fire across the vastness of the Pacific Ocean, remains available for those willing to study it and learn from it.